It began at dawn. The sea was still, almost apologetic, the way it lapped against the stones that morning. A faint mist clung to the shore like breath that refused to fade. To most, it was just another coastal morning, routine, gray, indifferent. But to the man who found the body, it was the kind of morning that never leaves you. He had been walking his dog along the narrow stretch between the dunes and the old seawall, a habit formed after the war to quiet the nerves. The dog, restless and stubborn, tugged toward the line of driftwood scattered across the sand. That was when he saw it. A man's legs, polished shoes pointed neatly toward the horizon, as though waiting for something. The rest of him lay propped against the wall. One arm rested oddly by his side, the other bent in an unnatural way, fingers curled inward. He looked asleep. His hair was combed, his suit pressed, a faint smile, almost courteous, on his face. Only the stillness gave him away. When the police arrived, they expected the usual, a drifter, perhaps, or someone lost to drink. But as the first inspector knelt beside the body, he noticed something strange. No sand on the shoes. No water marks. The man hadn't washed ashore. He'd been placed there. The coroner's van took him away before sunrise, leaving only shallow boot prints in the sand and the memory of that strange, serene face. By mid-morning, the story had reached the town's small police station. A sergeant unfolded the man's belongings onto a metal desk. A half-empty packet of cigarettes, a train ticket, a bus stub, a comb, and a neatly folded handkerchief. No wallet. No identification. Every label had been cut from his clothing with precision. Even the manufacturer's tag inside his suit had been sliced away. Suicide? Someone suggested. The inspector shook his head. Not without a note. Not dressed like this. The coroner's report arrived by noon. Cause of death. Inconclusive. No signs of violence. No water in the lungs. No external wounds. Only a faint trace of something in the stomach. Perhaps a poison, the kind that leaves no color, no taste. That evening, a journalist from the local paper stopped by the station, notebook in hand. She was young but already known for her persistence. She asked to see the body. The inspector hesitated, then agreed. The morgue was quiet, its white tiles reflecting the harsh glow of the overhead lamp. She stood at the edge of the steel table, studying the man's face. He was handsome, perhaps in his 40s, with a faint cleft in his chin and the kind of features that seemed familiar even if you'd never seen him before. Someone must know him, she murmured. Maybe, the inspector said. But we don't. She leaned closer. He looks peaceful. That's what worries me, the inspector replied. In the days that followed, the case became a quiet obsession for everyone who encountered it. Posters with the man's photograph were distributed across nearby towns. Travelers were questioned. Missing persons records were checked. Nothing matched. No one came forward. The press called him the unknown man. Others, more poetic, began calling him the Somerton gentleman, for the beach where he was found. But to the inspector, he was simply the man with no past. Then, a small discovery changed everything. During a second examination of the man's clothing, a technician found a hidden pocket sewn into the waistband of his trousers. Inside was a tiny, rolled piece of paper. It was torn cleanly from a book. On it, a single phrase printed in neat Persian script. Tamam Shud. The words translated to, "It is finished." The phrase sent ripples through the small department. The inspector turned it over in his hands, puzzled by its precision. It wasn't handwritten. It was printed, as if torn from a publication. But from where? The journalist, curious as ever, took a copy of the phrase to the town library. She spent hours flipping through poetry collections until, near closing time, she found it. The words Tamam Shud appeared on the final page of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, an English translation popular among romantics and philosophers. The book itself was rare but not unknown. A meditation on life, fate, and the finality of death. But what unsettled her was the tone. The way the page in her hands echoed the mystery in that morgue. She copied the passage and brought it to the inspector's office the next morning. "It's from this," she said. setting the open volume before him. The last page. The phrase means, the end. He looked down, brow furrowed. A suicide note, then? Maybe. But why hide it? She asked. And where's the book it came from? That question hung in the air like smoke. The search widened. Officers combed train stations, bus terminals, hotels. Days turned into weeks. The world outside moved on, news of elections, distant conflicts, rationing. But within the police files, the unknown man remained suspended in time. Then, a month later, a breakthrough. A man brought a worn copy of the Rubaiyat to the station. He said he had found it on the back seat of his car, parked near the beach on the night the body was discovered. It wasn't his car. It was borrowed. But when he cleaned it days later, he noticed the book tucked under a blanket. He thought nothing of it until he read about the mysterious phrase in the paper. The inspector examined the book. The final page was torn out. The missing piece fit perfectly. Inside the book's cover were faint impressions, as if someone had written on the page above with a pencil. The technicians used ultraviolet light and uncovered a series of random letters. No words, no language, just sequences of capital letters arranged in uneven lines. A code. At the bottom of the page, a phone number. The inspector traced it to a nearby address, a woman's flat overlooking the sea. Her name was not released to the press. Only the inspector and the journalist knew who she was. When they knocked on her door, she appeared calm, almost rehearsed. She was in her late 20s, with a quiet, self-contained manner. She claimed to have no idea who the man was. "Yes, that's my number," she admitted. "But I don't know how it got in that book." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying something she didn't say. The inspector noticed a framed photograph on the mantel. An officer in uniform, smiling, hand resting lightly on a woman's shoulder. The man in the photo wasn't the one from the beach, but the familiarity in the expression was unsettling. "Have you ever received a copy of this book?" the inspector asked. "Yes," she said quietly. "Years ago. A gift." "From whom?" "I don't remember." She looked away as she said it. After they left, the journalist lingered by the window of their parked car, watching the woman's silhouette move slowly through the curtains. There was something haunting in her composure, something carefully arranged, like the man's body by the sea. Back at the station, the inspector studied the coded letters again. He saw patterns forming and dissolving, repetitions, alignments, but nothing that made sense. Some said it was a cipher, others a love code. One officer suggested a list of initials, the remnants of secret meetings or names now lost to time. The journalist wrote her first feature for the evening edition. A man without a name, a message without a sender, and a woman without a past. The article spread across the country within days. The public was enthralled. The phrase Tamam Shud became a whispered symbol for unfinished stories, for the silence that lingers after truth refuses to surface. One night, unable to sleep, the journalist returned to the beach. The moon was sharp and white, painting the sand in shades of silver. She walked to the seawall, to the spot where the man had been found. The tide whispered at her feet. She tried to imagine his final moments. Did he walk here alone? Did someone wait in the shadows? The thought chilled her. The idea that someone had cared enough to dress him, to clean his shoes, to make sure his final image was serene. It wasn't cruelty. It was control. Behind her, the town's lights shimmered faintly through the fog, distant and safe. She picked up a fragment of driftwood and traced the words in the sand. Tamam Shud. Then, without meaning to, she whispered, "It is finished." But she knew it wasn't. A week later, the inspector received a letter. No return address, no name, just a single sheet of paper folded twice. Inside was a newspaper clipping of the journalist's article. Across it, in faint blue ink, someone had underlined one sentence. He looked peaceful, almost as though waiting for someone. Beneath it, 2 words. "She knows." The inspector felt the blood drain from his face. He called the journalist immediately, but she didn't answer. When he reached her apartment, the lights were off. The front door was unlocked. On the table by the window lay a single object, a copy of the Rubaiyat, closed, untouched. The final page was intact. But scrawled in pencil on the inside cover were 5 words, shaky and hurried. He wasn't supposed to die. That was the night the investigation changed. The inspector realized then that this wasn't just about identity, it was about intention, about something planned, then regretted. The next morning, he returned to the woman's flat by the sea. She wasn't home. The neighbors said she'd left before sunrise, carrying only a small suitcase. She was never seen again. The inspector stood for a long time in her empty living room. On the mantelpiece, the photograph was gone. The dust where it had rested formed a perfect rectangle, like a frame around absence. Through the window, the tide was coming in again, the same tide that had kissed the soles of that man's shoes. The inspector folded the note found in the journalist's flat and placed it beside the word fragment from the waistband. Tamam Shud. He wasn't supposed to die. 2 sentences, 2 endings, and somewhere between them, a story unfinished. Rain fell the morning she vanished. Not the kind that lashes, but the soft, persistent kind that blurs edges and hides details. The inspector stood by the window of his office, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. He hadn't slept. On his desk lay 2 items, the torn phrase, Tamam Shud, and the note scrawled in the journalist's hand. He wasn't supposed to die. He read them again and again, searching for alignment. One finished, the other regretted. The journalist's disappearance had left the department uneasy. Officially, she was listed as missing, presumed voluntary. But the inspector didn't believe that. She was too methodical, too deliberate, and she wouldn't have left her typewriter mid-page. He opened her last notebook. The handwriting began neatly, then shifted into restless loops near the end. Between lines of unfinished sentences were fragments. Woman's accent, trace of the North, book, gift before war, telegram, no record after 47, and underlined twice, not suicide, message. The inspector began to retrace the woman's steps. First the flat, then the places she frequented. The landlord recalled she'd received few visitors, mostly letters, foreign stamps, careful handwriting, all postmarked from small coastal towns. He'd once seen her burn a stack of them in the fireplace, late one evening. She watched the fire for a long time, the landlord said. Didn't move until it was nothing but ash. The inspector visited the local post office next. The clerk remembered her too. Quiet lady, she said. Always bought single stamps. Never more than one. He asked if she'd ever mailed anything overseas. The clerk nodded. A few times. To a man. Same handwriting each time. But the address changed. Do you recall any of the names? No, the clerk said softly. But I remember the envelopes smelled of sea salt and tobacco. That afternoon, the inspector returned to the evidence room. He spread out everything connected to the case, the coded letters, the ticket stubs, the book, the photographs. The ultraviolet prints of the letters glowed faintly under the lamp. He began grouping them, looking for patterns. The sequences repeated irregularly, but one cluster, MLABA, appeared twice. He traced the letters onto a fresh page, trying possible meanings. Initials? A unit code? A radio frequency? After hours of searching through military archives, he found something close. In a list of disbanded intelligence divisions from the final year of the war, a line caught his eye, MLAB Section Maritime Liaison and Broadcasting. A forgotten naval communications branch, one involved in transmitting encrypted signals to Allied ships across the Pacific. Disbanded in 1946. His pulse quickened. The pieces began to hum with faint connection. He visited the National Archives the next morning, navigating dust and silence. The file on MLAB was thin, most pages redacted, but one detail stood out. A list of personnel marked classified, unverified post-discharge locations. He scanned the names. Most were struck through, but one entry, handwritten, faint, remained unmarked. Lieutenant Charles Renner, Communications Officer. Missing, presumed deceased, 1948. The inspector stared at the name. The year matched. The timing fit. He took out the morgue photograph of the unknown man. The age, the posture, even the faint indentation on his ring finger, it could match an officer. But why erase him? And who had hidden his death beneath poetry? That evening, he returned to the journalist's apartment. The rain had stopped, leaving the air smelling of wet paper and dust. He searched her desk again, carefully this time. Inside a drawer, beneath a stack of old drafts, he found an envelope labeled, "Do not print, personal notes." Inside were 3 photographs, grainy, candid shots. In one, the unknown man stood beside the woman by the sea, both facing away from the camera. In another, they were seated at a cafe table mid-conversation. Her smile was small, hesitant. In the third, she stood alone on a pier, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. On the back of the first photograph, a date was written in blue ink, March 1947. So they had known each other. Before all of it, the inspector leaned against the window, piecing it together in silence. A communications officer who vanished after the war. A woman who received letters and burned them. A journalist who got too close and disappeared. And a phrase from a Persian poet, hidden like a signature. It was less a mystery now and more a confession written across time. He returned to the office early the next morning, determined to trace the name Renner through military channels. The response came quickly. An officer with that name had indeed served in naval communications, attached briefly to a post-war intelligence exchange in Cairo. No record after that. When asked for further files, the clerk at the archives simply said, "Access restricted under the Secrets Act." The inspector didn't stop. He contacted a retired signals officer he knew from the war, a man named Morgan who now lived in a quiet coastal town 2 hours away. Over tea in a small kitchen, he showed him the photograph. Morgan squinted. "That face. Yes, I remember him. Renner. Brilliant code man. Kept to himself. Always scribbling letters and numbers on the margins of newspapers. What happened to him?" Morgan shrugged. "Rumor was he fell in love. A civilian. Caused trouble. Those were sensitive years, everything watched, everyone measured. He was reassigned quietly. Some said he wanted out." "Did he leave the service?" "Officially? Yes. Unofficially? No one leaves cleanly from where he worked." Morgan looked up, eyes narrowing. "Why are you asking?" The inspector folded the photograph. "Because he turned up dead." Back in the city, the inspector cross-referenced Renner's last known address. It led him to a faded boarding house on the outskirts of town. The landlady remembered him well. Polite man, paid on time, smoked those foreign cigarettes. She showed the inspector his old room. Bare, dusty, untouched. A trunk sat in the corner, locked but brittle with age. He pried it open. Inside were personal effects, letters without envelopes, a small radio transmitter, a notebook. The pages of the notebook were filled with short phrases, some in English, others in cipher. Between them, one line repeated 3 times. "For her eyes only." He turned another page and found a pressed flower. A jasmine, dried and pale. Beneath it, a torn train ticket dated the same day he was found on the beach. The inspector sat back, exhaling slowly. Everything pointed toward the woman, but not as a killer, as something else. Connection. A witness, perhaps even the reason he died. That evening, he took the notebook to his apartment and began decoding the patterns. They were substitution ciphers, old ones used in radio transmissions. After hours of effort, he extracted fragments of a message. "The world moves on, but we, bound by what we carried, cannot." Another line followed, faint and incomplete. "If she receives this, she'll know, Tamam Shud." It wasn't a code. It was a farewell. The inspector realized then that the Tamam Shud slip wasn't an act of mystery. It was a conclusion, a man once lost in signals and secrecy, choosing his own last transmission. But the note found in the journalist's flat, he wasn't supposed to die, suggested someone else had tried to intervene, and failed. He wondered if the woman had found him too late. Weeks passed. The press moved on, chasing new stories. But the inspector couldn't let it rest. One night, as he sorted through the case files for the 100th time, the phone rang. A quiet voice on the other end spoke just one sentence. "You're looking in the wrong decade." The line went dead. The next morning, he requested access to wartime personnel files predating Renner's enlistment. After hours of searching, he found an old registry, civilian volunteers who had assisted in code-breaking operations during the early years of the war. Among them, Elena Ward, civilian linguist, Persian translations. He froze. The same woman. She hadn't been an ordinary civilian. She'd been part of the team decoding intercepted communications between allied and neutral nations, messages layered with poetry, metaphor, and mathematical disguise. Her specialty was the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the very book that later reappeared as a cipher for her lover's final words. The inspector drove to her old neighborhood that afternoon. Most houses were boarded up, the war years having drained the place of life. In the churchyard at the edge of town, he found a caretaker sweeping the path. When asked about the wards, the caretaker nodded slowly. "I remember the daughter. Quiet, smart girl. Left during the war to work in the city. Came back once, years later, to visit her mother's grave. Didn't stay long. Do you know where she went?" "No, but she left flowers. Jasmine, I think." The inspector looked toward the graves, rows of stone, weathered and nameless. The air smelled faintly of rain and blossoms. He thought of the dried jasmine in the officer's notebook. Two people, connected by the same symbols, speaking through silence and fragments. That evening, he returned home to find an envelope slipped under his door. No name, no address, just his own initials written neatly on the front. Inside was a single photograph. The journalist, alive, sitting at a train station bench, looking straight at the camera. On the back, a message in the same careful handwriting he'd seen before. "Some truths end where others begin. Leave the rest." He turned the photo over again, studying her eyes. They weren't pleading. They were resolute. She had chosen to disappear. The inspector knew then that the woman, the one who never spoke publicly, was alive somewhere. That she'd found a way to erase herself, as he once thought the man had been erased. They'd both lived inside the machinery of secrets long enough to know the cost of being found. In the weeks that followed, the case was quietly closed. Official cause of death: poisoning, self-administered. No further suspects. The inspector filed the documents, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was still unfinished. One evening, as he walked along the same beach where it all began, the sea was calm again, the air heavy with salt. He took from his pocket the small slip of paper, Tamam Shud, and the torn note from the journalist's flat. He held them together, two halves of one message, one from the man who chose to end, and one from the woman who couldn't accept it. The wind lifted the paper slightly, as if urging release. He let them go. The tide carried them outward, disappearing into the dark. As he turned to leave, he thought he saw a figure in the distance. Slim, motionless, watching the water. A scarf fluttered in the wind. When he blinked, she was gone. Back in his office, he typed the final line of his report. Some stories end not with answers, but with the quiet mercy of forgetting. He folded the paper, slipped it into an unmarked envelope, and locked it away. Outside, the rain began again, erasing footprints, blurring the past, softening the world into silence. Years passed. The tide changed, the station moved buildings, and the world turned toward new wars and new fears. But for the inspector, that winter on the coast never ended. It lived in the back of his mind. The man by the seawall, the folded slip of paper, the woman's eyes that seemed to hold both guilt and love. He had been transferred twice since then, promoted once. Yet he carried that case like a quiet confession, one he'd never been asked to make. Sometimes, late at night, he would unfold the single photograph he'd kept from the file. The unknown man seated beside the woman, both turned toward the sea. The light between them was gentle, unposed. Two people suspended in a moment of peace neither would ever find again. It reminded him that mysteries aren't solved. They fade. It was 10 years after the case was closed when the first letter arrived. No return address, no sender. Just a plain envelope slipped into the Daily Post at the station. Inside, a single photograph. A street in Lisbon. Crowded, sunlit, ordinary, except for a figure in the corner of the frame. A woman wearing a pale scarf, head bowed, carrying a jasmine flower in one hand. He recognized her instantly. On the back, written in faint pencil. For his peace. He didn't tell anyone. He simply placed the photograph inside his desk drawer, beside the original case notes, and locked it. That night, he took a long walk through the town. The post-war years had rebuilt everything in steel and glass, but some corners still carried the smell of the old world: coal smoke, wet rope, salt air. The kind of air that belonged to those who waited for things that never returned. He passed the harbor, the warehouse where naval equipment once came and went. The fog rolled low, muffling the city's new rhythm. Somewhere, a ship's horn called out, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo the man's final silence. He stopped beside the railing, gazing out at the lights. It struck him then that perhaps both of them, Renner and the woman, had been caught between the shifting lines of loyalty and love, between duty and mercy, and that their silence had been their last form of truth. Months later, another envelope arrived, this one thicker. Inside was a folded page from an old ledger, the kind used by naval supply officers. Across the top, a typed heading, Decryption Reference, MLAB. But what caught his attention was the handwritten note at the bottom. You were right to look for meaning, not guilt. He chose peace. I chose silence. Forgive the world for forgetting us. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, feminine. He sat there for a long time, reading the words again and again. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be. The ink carried her voice. The inspector began piecing through the old cipher again. He laid out the letters, the phrases, the fragments of code. Slowly, he began noticing something he'd missed years before. The sequences weren't random. They followed the pattern of a poem. He pulled out a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the same translation from which Tamam Shud had been torn. He scanned its verses line by line until he found it. An echo, not identical but close. The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. He whispered it aloud. The letters, the code, weren't messages of espionage or strategy. They were fragments of the poem itself, encrypted in the patterns of someone who had spent years writing secrets for others. Renner had been writing a farewell to the only person who would understand his language. The inspector realized what Tamam Shud truly meant in their story. It wasn't a declaration of finality, it was permission. A way of saying, it's finished now. You can stop carrying me. He wondered if the woman had ever received that message. Perhaps she had, and that's why she'd vanished, to honor it. He looked again at the Lisbon photograph. The faintest smile on her lips, the jasmine in her hand. She had understood. The following spring, the inspector retired quietly. No ceremony, no speech, just a signed form and a thin gold watch from the department. He rented a small cottage by the sea, far from the city, the kind of place where the air carried nothing but the sound of waves and gulls. There, he began to write, not reports but recollections. Not for publication, not for anyone's eyes but his own. He wrote about the man's shoes polished against the sand, the woman's trembling voice when she said she didn't remember, the journalist's last note. He wrote because silence had weight, and the only way to lift it was through remembrance. One evening, as he sat by the window, he noticed the faint glimmer of an envelope slid under his door. He opened it with careful hands. Inside was a single pressed flower, jasmine, pale and brittle, and a note. For the record, you never wrote. He wasn't supposed to die, but he did as he lived, making meaning of endings. Thank you for keeping it quiet. No signature again, just that soft scent, unmistakable even after all the years. He closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he smiled. He placed the flower inside his copy of the Rubaiyat and opened to the final page. The words waited there, eternal and still. Tamam Shud. He ran his fingers across them, feeling the paper's grain. Somewhere beyond the window, The sea continued its slow, rhythmic motion, endings blending into beginnings. He understood now what had haunted him all these years. It wasn't the mystery. It was the mercy hidden within it. They had lived through a world where truth was a weapon, where words could end wars or ruin lives. And in that world, their silence had been an act of love. One summer afternoon, years later, a young archivist visited him. She had been sent to review old unsolved cases before they were transferred to Central Records. Among them, she found the file marked Tamam Shud case, 1948. She was bright, curious, the kind who still believed every question deserved an answer. "I've read this file," she said, setting it on his table. "I don't understand why it was never reopened. There are gaps, letters missing, reports incomplete." The inspector looked out toward the sea. "Because sometimes, the gaps are the truth." She frowned gently. "You think they knew each other?" He nodded. "Yes, but not in the way most people think. They weren't hiding from justice, they were hiding from the past." The young woman tilted her head. "Then what does Tamam Shud mean to you?" He smiled faintly. "It means enough." After she left, he walked down to the shore. The same stretch of sand where it had all begun decades ago. The seawall was crumbling now, the stones softened by salt and time. He sat there until the sun dipped low. The tide whispered the same gentle rhythm he remembered from that first morning, the one that had brought a nameless man to the world's attention and then let him fade. He took from his pocket a small brass locket he'd found in the bottom of his drawer that morning, something he hadn't remembered keeping. Inside, folded carefully, was a tiny photograph of the woman standing on the pier, her hand raised to her eyes against the sun. He hadn't placed it there. He watched the water turn gold, then gray. In that quiet, he imagined them both, Renner and the woman. Somewhere far away, years older perhaps, their names long erased from ledgers and memory. Maybe they'd found each other again, or maybe not. But either way, they'd slipped free of the machinery that had owned their lives. He thought of the inspector he once was, the man who needed every mystery solved, every truth documented. He wasn't that man anymore. He whispered, "It is finished," and meant it. A week later, the archivist returned to the office to catalog the case. But when she opened the drawer where the files were kept, the folder was gone. In its place lay a single book, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Inside the cover, written in faded ink, were the words, "For the woman who never spoke, and the man who finally listened." No name, no initials. The archivist closed the book and looked out the window. The rain had started again, gentle and unhurried. Somewhere beyond it, the sea kept moving, keeping its secrets. Years later, when the inspector's cottage was cleared, the landlord found very little. Some notebooks, a typewriter, and a box of personal papers. Inside the box was a single envelope addressed simply, "To whoever remembers." The landlord handed it to the authorities. They opened it, expecting a will, or perhaps instructions for burial. Instead, they found a short letter. Every mystery begins with a question. But sometimes, mercy lies in not demanding the answer. We carry one another's silences. That's all any of us ever do. Beneath the letter, pressed flat and fragile, was a final jasmine flower. When the file was eventually archived for good, it was given a new title. Case 4319, the Tamam Shud mystery, closed. But in the margin of the catalog entry, in the handwriting of the archivist who filed it, someone had added one last note. Perhaps not closed, perhaps finished. The sea continued its endless whisper against the shore. Somewhere, the tide reached for the stones of an old seawall, smoothing away what was left of the past. And as the last light faded from the horizon, the words that had haunted them all seemed to settle over the world one final time. Tamam Shud, it is finished.